Okay, you're live.
Testing 1, 2, 3. Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you're all enjoying the conference as much as I am. I'm Charles Kimball, the host of the History of Southeast Asia podcast. Now, I want to apologize for the appearance here. First off, there we had a glare problem when I did the training for this conference, so I threw a pink blanket on the window behind me, but we're still getting a little glare. I think I'm going to have to do this with my glasses off. There, you all probably would rather see my eyes than glare in the glasses. There, does let you know I probably won't look like this if you see me in real life. Anyway. Give you a bit of an introduction. I think I may be the oldest podcaster taking part in this. I'm currently 61 years old, and I launched the History of Southeast Asia podcast 4 years ago because I was inspired by the other history podcasts I was listening to. Give you a bit of a background. I'm currently in Lexington, Kentucky. They're part of the territory that Royfield mentioned in an hour ago as the red state heartland of America. And I believe I'm about 130 miles away from Ryan Stitt, one of our other speakers. However, I lived most of my life in Orlando, Florida, so I don't have a Kentucky accent. And during my last 5 years in Florida, I taught a computer course at Valencia Community College, and because of that, that involved teaching PowerPoint. So I've created a quite elaborate PowerPoint presentation, which I hope you will all enjoy. And the first history podcast I listened to was Lars Brownworth. The one by Lars Brownworth, 12 Byzantine Emperors. And I think that's the oldest one, except maybe for History According to Bob. And then a few years later, I discovered Dan Carlin, also Rob Monaco's podcast, History of the World. There, like all of you, I wonder where he is now. And I was inspired to do one of my own because I've been a big fan of history for at least 50 of my 61 years. You could say history is my life because I made a hobby of writing world history papers. And but I didn't want to do the same topic as someone else was already doing. Then I would be compared with that podcaster while I'm still a beginner. So I had to look for a podcast topic that I was knowledgeable about that wasn't already taken. And as it turned out, Southeast Asia fit the bill best. And Southeast Asia is a part of the world I've always been interested in. In case you haven't figured it out by now, I'm old enough to remember the Vietnam War. That was an ongoing series of news stories while I was a child. And as a matter of fact, if you listen to the current episodes of my podcast, I've been talking about the Vietnam War there. And then in 1985, I married a pen pal from the Philippines. They're another Southeast Asian country, and we're still together now. And that's kept up my interest in the region since then. And so I've been working on the episode since then, and I guess you could say the rest is history. Now I'm going to go ahead and give you my presentation. I was inspired to do this subject by Ben Jacobs. He's been one of the other podcasters who's given me encouragement as I went along. So bravo to Ben. One of the things he said was that he likes the idea that I'm covering the history of non-Western civilizations. And so as a result, I've created a presentation calling for more attention on non-Western history. So here we go. Okay. I don't know why it isn't coming up here, but let's see. Okay, here we go. Equal time for the East. That's what I call it. Now, I don't know about those of you who are watching from outside the United States, but over here, the typical American bookstore will divide its history books between 3 shelves. That's whether you go to Barnes and Noble or Half Price Books or wherever. I won't say Borders because they're not in business anymore. You will find one shelf on American history. You will find one shelf on military history. And you will find a third shelf that covers everything else. As a matter of fact, in the podcast, I pointed out when I started covering the Vietnam War that I've got all 3 of those kinds of history currently covered. Now, for those of you in other countries, it's probably not too different. If Christophs Andresens is watching, I'm sure that the bookstore near him will have a shelf on Latvian history. Likewise, you go to an American school, you will find most of their courses are on American and European history. Now, when I was in college, I took a course on Egyptology, and I remember the last time we got together, our professor, he was a fellow you probably heard of from Cairo University, Dr. Gabala Ali Gabala, and he told us, contrary to what the university teaches, history does not begin with Greece. And now Western civilization classes may talk about Egypt and Mesopotamia, but then they'll go with Greece, and then it's all Western civilization from that point on. But what about the rest of the world? Doesn't it have something to teach us about humanity too? The purpose of this presentation is to make the case that everyone should have at least a working knowledge of the history of non-Western civilizations. That doesn't mean you have to attend a full-fledged course, but you should know some of the basics, like the overall trends. And that's something you can pick up from a podcast. In fact, one of the reasons why I like doing this is that I found many people would rather learn history from a podcast than from a classroom. Now, where are the non-Western civilizations? Well, they're mainly in Africa and Asia. Okay, here's a street scene from Timbuktu, and I'm sure you all recognize the Taj Mahal. Those represent Africa and Asia. Now, pre-Columbian civilizations in North and South America are okay. That's like the Maya, the Aztecs, the Inca, and the South Pacific before 1500. Because after 1500, you start having Europeans explore the area. And so to represent that, we have an old picture of the Easter Island statues. Now, everything else, Europe, present-day North America, South America, and Oceania, is out. That's Western civilization. Now, let's compare world population by continent. So this will show you how important non-Western civilization is, or should I just say Eastern civilization. Now, these are 2010 figures. I'm sure in every category there'll be a few more people now. For the whole world, we've got a little over 7.5 billion people. For Asia, we've got 4.582 billion. That's 60% of the world's population. For Africa, we've got 1.2 billion, or 16%. For Europe, 739 million. North America is 579 million. South America is 423 million. Oceania is 38 million. Remember, except for Australia, New Zealand, and New Guinea, the Pacific is mostly ocean. Yep, almost forgot. Now, I marked Asia and Africa red because if you put them together, that's 76%, more than 3/4 of the world's population. Now, this picture I found online also conveys this idea. Now, you see, we have a circle here around the most important part of Asia. It includes the Indian subcontinent, China, Mongolia, Korea, Japan, and all of Southeast Asia. It says here, there are more people living inside this circle than outside of it. Now, for the part of the world I talk about, Southeast Asia has 618 million people. That's 8%, or 1/12 of the world's population. 1 out of every 12 people in the world lives in the area shown on this map. Well, maybe a little more because we got South China on there too. But 1 out of every 12 are in the 11 countries that I cover in my podcast. And more than half of those people are in just 2 countries, Indonesia and the Philippines. So you can see, if you leave out the story of non-Western civilizations, you leave out a tremendous chunk of the story of the human race. Okay, now some of you may recognize these books. These 11 books are the life work of Will Durant, probably the most important historian of the 20th century. Okay, now his series of books is called The Story of Civilization, and he published them between 1933 and 1975. As you can see here, the last one, The Age of Napoleon, he got all the way up to like maybe the Battle of Waterloo. But then he died before he got a chance to write anything about the 200 years since that time. Now, take a look at the titles. The first one is called Our Oriental Heritage. I did read that one. There he talks about the ancient civilizations in and around the Middle East, Egypt, Mesopotamia, and then some of the others like the Phoenicians and the Persians. But look at the rest of these titles. The Life of Greece, Caesar and Christ, The Age of Faith, The Renaissance, The Reformation, The Age of Reason Begins, The Age of Louis XIV, The Age of Voltaire, Rousseau and Revolution, The Age of Napoleon. All those names are pulled from European history. So for the vast majority of his work was about Western civilization. He only talked a little bit about Eastern civilization, and I don't know if he ever even mentioned some of the other civilizations outside of the Middle East and East Asia. I don't know if he mentioned sub-Saharan Africa, for instance, or the Maya in the New World. So that's why I said up here, Will Durant should have known better. Because of the way people get around these days, well, before the COVID-19 lockdown anyway, our communities are more diverse than ever. In the typical large city, you can find someone from any ethnic group if you look hard enough. And for example, I've noticed that the sushi chefs in my local supermarket are all Burmese. Well, maybe you won't find a Hottentot or an Inuit, but you know what I mean. Now, for those of you not familiar with the term Inuit, we used to call them Eskimos, but since a conference in the 1970s, they have called themselves Inuit, and they want us to use the same name. Oops, I'll have to take back that last statement. This company has an office near me. Now, a few years ago, I applied for a job opening with the Bering Straits Native Corporation. I don't know why, but they have an office in my hometown of Kentucky. Now, I didn't get the job, but if I had, I'm sure that my boss and many of my coworkers would have been Inuit, because when I did some research on this company, I found out they're based in Nome, Alaska, and the company is run by Native Alaskans. Now, the more different groups of people you have, the more points of view you have. And don't forget the effect of individuality. That means variations in opinion, and sometimes a different opinion entirely. After all, since we're only human, some inconsistency should be expected. Now, case in point, I heard an Israeli once tell me that over in Israel, you only need three people to express four political opinions. Maybe you're in a community like that as well. Now, to understand another person's point of view, you need to understand where he or she comes from, which means understanding what kind of heritage they have. Understanding the heritage means understanding the history. The next slides will give two examples. The first one is Africa. To understand Africans, you need to know that Africa was home to many kingdoms in the past, with special achievements of their own. Then Europeans came to exploit Africa and carved it up into colonies. Most people of African descent who live elsewhere are descended from Africans who were brought to those places as slaves. The African colonies have since gained independence, but a lot of their problems, especially with borders, got started during the colonial period. Now, the example I can make there, having to do with borders, is that the Europeans did not pay attention to tribal boundaries when they established the borders between their colonies. They drew the lines according to what was convenient for them. The result was that in some African countries like Nigeria and Sudan, they put together tribes that did not get along with each other. I mean, that's the reason why Sudan split in two a few years ago. And you now have South Sudan, and as well as the original Arabic-speaking Sudan. And in other cases, they divided tribes between their colonies, and they're still split today. An example of that would be the Somalis. Less than half of the Somali population lives in quote-unquote Somalia. The rest of them are divided between Djibouti, Ethiopia, and Kenya. Now, I mentioned special achievements. Here's a picture of one of them. An excellent bronze head, which was made by one of the most advanced of the African kingdoms, Benin, in what is now southwest Nigeria. Okay, now let's see where China is coming from. To understand the Chinese, you need to know that China was the world's most impressive nation for an amazingly long time in size, population, technology, wealth, and strength. The Golden Ages lasted 1,306 years. If you just count the Han, Tang, Song, and Ming dynasties. Now I know Chris Stewart is here, and he would probably want to lengthen that period out by throwing in a few more time periods, like maybe the first half of the Qing dynasty from 1644 to 1800. Along that line, as late as 1800, China had the world's largest economy. They're the largest gross domestic product. In fact, it took the Industrial Revolution for other countries to catch up. But then China was exploited, defeated, and humiliated for a century and a half by Europe and Japan. Think of the Opium Wars, to give just one example. I mean, there are certain corporations around today that we think of as evil, but today's corporations can't hold a candle to the British East India Company, because back in its heyday, it got millions of Chinese addicted to opium. Since mainland China came under communist rule in 1949, much of the country's domestic and foreign policy has been an effort to regain the number one status the nation once had. To give an example of that, I would point to the current dispute over who owns the South China Sea. China's claiming the lion's share of it, while the other countries around the South China Sea, like Vietnam, Malaysia, and the Philippines and Brunei, they feel they should have part of it too. And in fact, I keep track of this issue because my wife is from one of the countries that's affected by it. Now, here's an example of an excellent bronze work from China. This is a bronze elephant wine vessel from the Shang dynasty, meaning that it's more than 3,000 years old. A lot of songs and stories include references to a culture's history. And so you have to know that history to get those references. To give one example, this is I tip my hat off to Royfield on this. I happen to be a reggae fan, and reggae songs have historical and political references all the time. Some people think all the lyrics talk about is praise Jah and pass the ganja, but that's not entirely the case. And the same thing goes for African music. I'm a world music fan too. They're what we commonly call Afropop. And so along that line, I included this picture of Nelson Mandela. If you listen to South African songs, quite often you'll see references to the past history, especially the bad old days of apartheid. And I chose this picture because I thought it was a good symbol of the end of apartheid. This is when Nelson Mandela and the man who released him from prison, Frederick W. de Klerk, received the Nobel Peace Prize together back in the early 1990s. And if you travel, knowing the history behind the places you visit allows you to appreciate those places and the people living in them more. So in a nutshell, learning non-Western history is just a way of getting to know your neighbors. The end. Okay, now if you're not a listener to the History of Southeast Asia podcast already, this is the URL for the website that hosts my recordings, blueberry.com. You can also listen to it off Stitcher, Google Play, iTunes, Spotify, and pretty much any other good website or app where you get your podcasts. Now, it's not yet on Pandora, or iHeartRadio, but I'm working on that.
Okay, looks like you have a few questions.
Okay, good.
Open the question area.
Yes, I'm trying to end the sharing now.
Okay.
Okay. All right, okay, yeah, we have two of them. Yeah, good question, Ben. I pointed that out in the introductory episode to the podcast. I said that 85% of Southeast Asia's people live on only 15% of the land. Maybe I should read the question before I continue. He said, "This is maybe a question that's not possible to answer, but we're talking about an area that is mostly water and mountainsides. How on the earth is the population so huge?" And there's also the factor that the mountain-covered areas are mostly jungle because of the hot and wet climate that you have everywhere. And in fact, both of the times that I visited the Philippines, the heat stood out to me more than anything else when I was over there. I don't know what else I have to say. The main factor there is that wet rice cultivation can feed a tremendous number of people. And that's also why the largest populations in the region, on the mainland at least, have been in river valleys, which are the best places for growing rice. You've got the Irrawaddy and the Salween in Myanmar and a few others. You've got the Menam or Chao Phraya River in Thailand. You've got the Mekong running through Laos, Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam, and in northern Vietnam, you've got the Red River. And in the islands, there are Luzon in the Philippines and Java in Indonesia have large areas for growing rice, and that's why both of them have very large populations too. And about a year ago, the president of Indonesia announced that he's going to move the capital of the country from Jakarta, which is on the northwest coast of Java, to an unspecified location on the east side of Borneo. And he said he did it because he was afraid of climate change and that some natural disaster someday might flood Jakarta. But I'm sure he also wanted to get the capital over to a place that's less crowded. So there have been attempts to grow rice in the highlands. Their dry cultivation of rice is possible. And you have to use different strains of rice plants for that. And that's the red rice and the black rice that you sometimes see in Asian stores, but that's never been as productive as the kind of rice that you grow in wetlands. Okay, I'll go to the other question. It says, what country or culture in Southeast Asia would you say is most underappreciated in the West? Well, for that answer, I'm first inclined to say Indonesia. And that's because of the size of their population. Last time I checked, it's 250 million people. And also, although they've been an ally of the Western nations most of the time since independence, they were one of the charter members of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, you almost never see them in the news here in the United States. And their case of that would be the struggle for independence of the half island of East Timor. I still run into people today who've never heard of East Timor, which is technically the youngest country in Southeast Asia. Although I remember seeing a few stories about its attempts to achieve independence all the way back to 1975. They're definitely an underreported part of the world here in America. And there was a podcast a few years ago covering Indonesian history and done by an Australian fellow named Anthony Fresina. I think he made the same point when he got started. And that was part of the reason why he chose Indonesia as the country he wanted to cover. For second place, I would, as in underappreciated cultures, I would say Myanmar, formerly Burma. And because they're also not often mentioned here in the West, but in this case, it's because they brought it on themselves. For most of my lifetime, from their 1962 to 2015, they were ruled by a military junta that got along with almost nobody, and they were damn proud of it. So as a result, it was very hard to get information about what was happening over there. When I did the research for my podcast, I had different experiences with each country I looked up information on. I found Vietnam and the Philippines to be the easiest countries to cover because the United States has been involved in both of them for a very long time, while Burma, or Myanmar as it's been called since 1989, they almost never appeared in the news. Now since the junta stepped down and they're now officially a democracy, that situation's not so rigid now, and that's why most of us know something about the plight of one of the ethnic minority groups in the country, the Rohingyas. And so in a future episode of the podcast, I'm definitely going to mention that. Let's see. As far as I got another question here from Brian Simmons. Do you think it's too late for African countries to redraw their borders along more natural boundaries? I would say it's not too late. You never want to say never, but when they became independent, they had an unofficial agreement among themselves to not change the borders because that would mean all too many opportunities to start new wars. And I think when the Organization of African Unity was set up, what they now call the African Union, I think they may have even put that in writing that they weren't going to dwell on border issues very much. Let's see. Okay, I got a question here. Can you speak to inequalities in wealth in the region and how that's affected development, both historically and present day? Yes. In Southeast Asia, when it comes to wealth, the number one country, the number one richest country is definitely Singapore, due to the emphasis they've had on commerce since the British acquired the city. Number two would be Brunei. Now, about 20 years ago, Brunei was in the number one spot because that little state with a small population was sitting on a big pool of oil that made them filthy rich. But then they had a really bad political scandal over there, which cost billions of dollars. I'm going to talk about that in a future episode. There it involved the youngest brother of the Sultan of Brunei. The country in the number 3 spot is Malaysia, because they have 2 very good resources, rubber and tin, and they've used them intelligently since the days when they were a British colony. In fact, the British introduced the rubber. I talked about that in episode 23 of my podcast. Number 4 is Thailand. And I'm tempted to call Thailand the most successful country overall in the region, because unlike the others, they were never a colony of the West, and they were able to enter the modern world with their culture, especially the monarchy and Buddhism, more or less intact. Okay, now as far as inequalities and wealth, of course they're all the other countries that I haven't mentioned are a lot poorer, and it's one of the tragedies of the modern world that of the countries in Southeast Asia, only Singapore was able to follow the example of Japan, South Korea, and Hong Kong and Taiwan when it came to economic development. You may have heard of some of those countries called the Four Dragons or the Four Tigers of Asia. There are the other countries weren't able to, even when they were blessed with resources. There the Philippines, for example, has been held back by corruption, especially under the Marcos regime back in the 1970s and 80s. But hopefully they won't always stay that way. We can always be optimistic. Let's see. Next question. I believe Japan and Germany spend on infrastructure in Cambodia and Vietnam. Do you think this is purely altruistic or seeking strategic influence? I'm inclined to say yes, because it's there's certainly less self-interest visible here when you compare it with what China is doing in that part of the world. In a news story I recently read, the Cambodian seaport, Sihanoukville, I've heard that the Chinese have invested so much into that port that they've virtually taken it over. And while they've pumped a lot of money into the local economy, it mainly goes to the Chinese that are already there. So in that sense, they've kept it among themselves. Okay, well, I think we got done with about 2 minutes to spare.
Okay, are you ready to stop going live?
Yes, I am.
Okay, do you want to do a quick little finisher for everyone?
Okay, well, I want to thank all of you for hearing me out. I'm always pleased when someone's willing to take the time to hear what I have to say, because I know that time is almost as important as money in today's world, maybe even more so. And I wish you all a great rest of the day, and that you enjoy the remaining discussions that take place here at the conference. And for those of you who aren't listening to the podcast already, I hope you will become listeners now. And I'll see you online, or as I say in the podcast, thank you for listening, and come back when the monsoon winds are blowing right.